Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming. I've kind of really been looking forward to doing this one actually, because it's such an interesting and important area, and I have to admit, I've kind of the last few months kind of really got into it, and kind of a lot of reading and kind of seeing it more kind of in my practice as well. So it's really important, I think, that we just kind of take stock of things really. So to be perfectly honest, and I think maybe I'm not on my own with this. Up until kind of this year, really, I think for me, AI was something that I just kind of heard about. It was kind of there, it was being discussed, but it just seemed to me quite a kind of conceptual thing, really. And then this year, of course, we had ChatGPT, which came on the scene, and that really was, I guess, like a moment really where this almost like kind of science fiction thing becomes a reality, because all of a sudden we all had access to this technology. And I'm not going to make any assumptions about people's knowledge areas in this area, because there's quite a lot to it and it's quite technical. But essentially, AI is a way of using a computer to make decisions and to process tasks, and it functions very similar to the way that the human brain functions, which is to have the kind of rational thinking part of the brain, which is able and capable of making decisions, and it makes those decisions based upon memory. So effectively, things that have happened, repetitive things that have happened in the past, kind of inform the kind of rational decisions that we make as human beings. Now, don't worry, this is a talk about employment law, not about kind of neuroscience, but it's interesting because that's true about the way that the brain works in terms of intelligence. But of course, it neglects the fact that there's a heck of a lot more going on in the brain in terms of emotional responses and other features as well. But that's kind of the basis of it, really. So it's a kind of software application, effectively, that's able to do routine processes and able to make decisions. ChatGPT itself is an application that you can use, and effectively it reminds me of those who might remember and old enough to remember when we used to have something called Ask Jeeves, which was like the kind of first thing we got on the internet, where you would just put a question in and it would kind of give you a response. For me, it's a kind of more kind of advanced, I say much more advanced version of that. And it was one of those things that was being talked about, and all of a sudden it just started to be used. I started using it myself. I started to hear kind of other people that were using it. It's some really, really interesting statistics that I'm just going to read out to you, which give you some indication of kind of how much this has grown. So how much ChatGPT, which is AI, has grown. So the time it took for ChatGPT to reach 1 million users was 5 days, which is absolutely incredible. So if you look at, for example, Instagram, so Instagram took 2.5 months to reach the same amount of users. Spotify, 5 months. Twitter was 2 years. So in 5 days, the increase in the amount of people that were using it was absolutely huge. It went to 1 million users. And then if you look at the increase in users, so from November 2022, these are amazing statistics, by the way. In November 2022, there were 152.7 million people using ChatGPT. In April of this year, 1.8 billion people are using ChatGPT. So for all of us that think, well, AI, that's not something that's, particularly relevant to me, it's not something that we're going to be using in our business. I wouldn't be surprised if people in your business are using it, and perhaps you might not know about it. And of course, if they are using it, some of this webinar really is about kind of how you approach that and how you deal with it. There's always a problem. There's always a problem with legal issues when you've got fast-moving technology or fast-moving changes in society and very slow-moving law. So the law always moves painfully slowly, but of course technology moves very, very quickly. And those statistics I've just read out to you kind of indicate that kind of massive transformational change which can happen almost overnight. So what I'm kind of seeing, to some extent anecdotally, is when I talk with employers and I talk with contacts, and even, to be honest, people that I work with is that ChatGPT is starting to be used, and it's kind of been used in a way of almost a bit just kind of playing around with it. Obviously, some people are using it in a more kind of more structured way, but it's an incredibly, if anybody hasn't tried it, you've got to try it, because if you don't, you kind of can't really fully appreciate what it actually does. But it's incredibly useful tool for things like blog writing, market research, proposals, emails. Because what it effectively does is you give it something to do, write me a presentation on XYZ that lasts 30 minutes, and it will literally just produce it for you. Very good for writing webinars. This whole thing, I didn't have to do anything at all. I just got ChatGPT to do it. So I'm just literally just reading out from a script now. That was a joke, just in case anybody didn't get it. Now this issue, so ChatGPT, I think I've made it pretty clear, is out there and it's being used. But think about that for a minute. If you've got an organization, you've got all of these people that are working in your organization who you know, and you kind of have agreements with them about what they do and what their job includes. And now it's almost like we've got this other kind of entity which is potentially within the business, writing your blogs, doing proposals, all of these types of things which that technology can potentially do. But this issue we have, isn't it, is to do with the law kind of not catching up. So there's lots of kind of issues with this, which to some extent I don't think have properly been appreciated yet. One of the significant issues and one area which is subject to a lot of debate and discussion at the moment is who owns the copyright to that material. So for example, if I'm asked to write a blog about the UK market for caravan sales, for example, I could ask ChatGPT to do that, and it would produce something. And how would it produce it? Well, what it would do is it would kind of search for articles, posts, or books, literature. So basically kind of trawl through all of the internet, all of this information, to get that information and then to process it into a response. So what it's actually doing is it's taking that data, that information, which is potentially copyrighted material. But then you get loads of really, really fascinating issues about, well, is it the ChatGPT producer that owns it? Is it the end user, because they're the person that said, I want this information, so as soon as it's sent to them, it's theirs? Is there some way that it's actually owned by the article that it originally came from? All of these things, I'd love to say I've got the answer for them. The truth is we don't, because it's such a kind of developing thing. But what you don't want to find yourself in a situation of being is to kind of go into these things without kind of setting out some kind of framework for how you are going to use it. What you don't want to be doing, I don't think, which is happening a lot, is you've got a business, people are using this technology, it's helping a little bit here and there, but you've not really got eyes on it. You don't know to what extent it's being used. You don't know whether, if you're paying somebody to do a particular job, which is relatively routine, it might be producing articles, it might be various things, and you're expecting that they're being produced by an employee, where in fact they're not. I think as an employer, that's the type of thing that you would want to be aware of. And certainly I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the types of things that you might want to do at this stage, really, just to kind of put some kind of sensible protection in there as best you can with the way things are in terms of the law and the legislation. So I'm talking a lot about ChatGPT because it's just been such a visible thing. But of course, AI isn't just limited to that functionality of being able to input a question and receive an answer, the kind of Ask Jeeves type of thing. The applications for AI are much more varied than that, and some of them we're kind of familiar with, really. So chatbots, that's a kind of real kind of visible feature of AI, which I think most of us are quite familiar with, in which, kind of sales, called marketing, or engaging with a company, rather than having to phone up and ask questions or send emails and deal with a human being. Instead, you can use a kind of AI thing, which almost feels like you're talking with a human being, but of course you're not. So that's something that's kind of very much on the rise, and the technology for that has got much better. So if you look at kind of how chatbots used to be and how they are now, they're basically much more intelligent because they've done more learning, they know more, they understand more about how humans communicate. So all of that stuff is advancing. Um, but again, you would need to kind of interrogate how that works in practice. Cobots, which I just think is an absolutely fantastic name. Cobots are the way to think of it is, we know what car factories look like. I mean, other factories have manufacturing look like, where we have these kind of robots that are doing things, which is effectively limbs, that kind of artificial limbs, which lift things and move things around. Well, that technology now is having AI put into it, so it actually does more. It's able to, I mean, you wouldn't believe the types of things it can do in terms of keeping an eye on colleagues, working out when more training is needed. So you've got this kind of mechanical arm thing next year that's also keeping a bit of an eye on you. That's the kind of the way that the technology is going. Wearable tech. Now, this is, from my reading, from my understanding, seems to be a real thing in the USA, and it can cover a whole range of things. So wearable tech can just be, pretty basic watch or a GPS system so that you can kind of know where people are. But increasingly, it can be used to measure productivity. So even in kind of factory warehouse environments, it can work. It can give data about the way that bodies are moving, the way how quickly people perform tasks, all of these types of things. I mean, it's all very interesting, very useful, but it does, I don't know, it does feel slightly odd kind of talking in these terms. It's slightly reminiscent of the types of things potentially that were going on, in the workhouses, with all these kind of Victorian studies that were done in terms of, how many rests people should have to be more productive. It kind of got that feel to it, really. Having said that, all of that, that application for that technology doesn't necessarily need to be in that way. It could also be for other aspects as well, health and safety, things like that as well. So we've got to be careful, really, to kind of fully consider that what the technology is capable of, and actually be quite open-minded in terms of really kind of positive things as well that it could also be used for. So just to be clear, this isn't me having a go at AI and ChatGPT. I do, not wishing to spoil the conclusions at the end. It's a really useful thing for organizations. But it's really a case of kind of getting things right. It's playing a big role in HR. So two main kind of areas where I'm seeing it being used in HR. And again, very heavily used in America, but as it often happens, something that happens in America then is often translates to what we're doing over here. So very kind of useful function for recruitment and selection. The situation is you have a job that you advertise and you get 200 applications for that job. And that, for anybody that's been through that process, is a pretty laborious process, going through all of those applications and deciding which one to take to the next stage. And probably anybody that's done that will also know that out of those 300 applications, it's probably only often a relatively small number of them that actually have the requirements that you've specified for that job role. So that's quite a neat feature, really, where you could see AI being able to go through those applications and make decisions, relatively kind of straightforward, almost binary, objective decisions, really, about whether somebody has the particular qualifications for that role, particular features that are required. That's quite a time-saving thing for an employer to be able to do. But of course, it can go much further than that as well. It can be used to do things like writing a job description. Again, it's quite a common thing for people to have to do a lot of that, writing job descriptions. It can be quite difficult. So it's a bit easier, really, to just go on ChatGPT and say, can you write me a job description for a warehouse job, which is 3 days a week and involves these things, and it will produce it. Question, though, is always, isn't it, whether that's right or not, and whether actually that is kind of tailored to precisely what you do, because it misses that kind of human touch. The technology can be used to basically search through social media, the internet, for candidates who might be suitable for a particular role. So kind of doing headhunting, really. So AI actually going through the internet by itself and saying, well, this person here is pretty good. You could maybe, get in contact with them. Even so, with job applicants, using AI to do a kind of social media assessment of that person. So looking at what they've posted online, trying to form a view of that person. AI can do that. Chatbots being used to communicate with candidates, that kind of stage where there's lots of kind of conversations with a candidate. It could be some of them could be quite early, quite administrative. A lot of that starting to be used by chatbots. And one which is really interesting, actually, and again, being used a lot in America, which sure will be being used here at some point, is using AI. So you film an interview, basically. So somebody comes in for an interview and you film them, and the AI is able to pick up certain things with body language, and so it's able to kind of make an assessment as to that person given how they kind of behave in the interview. Now, there's lots of problems with this, aren't there? Potentially, there's also lots of benefits as well, actually, because it used right, it means you can free his time up to do other things. But there's potentially issues with this, and on the recruitment side, so this kind of sifting through job descriptions. Well, I can see that that's a useful application in certain things when somebody's completely not qualified for a job. I think it's quite reasonable that you would reject them for that job. But then what happens when things become a little bit more subtle, and actually the reason why somebody doesn't have precisely the right requirement for that job is because they've got a disability, and that then brings us into the realm of it potentially being discriminatory. And I'll talk more about that because it's a bit of a theme. Job descriptions, like I've said, well, it depends on the job description, doesn't it? Probably easier for AI to do than others. A lot of people use it actually as a kind of sketch type thing. So what they do is they'll kind of get AI to do the job description, so it's almost like a kind of rough view of it, some points, and then kind of tidy it up and make sure it's right, and then kind of sense check it. The looking for candidates online, well, the AI is only going to find candidates that it believes are suitable, and that suitability is based upon the information that it has. So if that suitability for a role is in some way biased, that can result in discrimination. So it could be that in some way the information that goes into the AI has some kind of bias against women, for example. So there was a case involving Amazon, actually, which had a similar set of circumstances. So what they did is they basically used AI to find candidates for a tech role, and what it did is it actually had a bias towards middle-aged men, because what it found was that this particular tech requirements for this role, women had been very, very underrepresented in that area for many years. So it created this bias in the artificial intelligence, which made it think that men tended to be better at the job than women. So that's a really kind of clear example of that. The chatbots communicating, well, I guess it's a question of degree, isn't it? It's the extent to which you kind of use that kind of technology. But there's always that personal touch, isn't it? Particularly with recruitment, actually, very kind of personal touch where somebody is kind of, going through a time where they're not being able to tell their employer about what they're looking at, all these types of things. So often that human touch with an individual is what's needed. And it may be that some people use them, some people don't, and some people prefer those that do have more of that human touch. I suspect people will kind of make their own decisions about that. And I'm not too concerned necessarily from a kind of discrimination point of view about the chatbots at that level, because all they're really doing is kind of giving information, taking information, not really making any decisions. Having said all of that, you've then got the issue about the data that they have. So what do you do with that data? And again, I'll talk a bit more about that, but brings us back to these kind of solid issues that we have to deal with as to who owns this data. You know, who does it belong to? So I should say, actually, interesting thing on the chatbot. So in 2016, might have been 2017 actually, 2016 I think, Twitter designed their own kind of AI bot basically. So the idea is that you'd have this kind of intelligent chatbot thing that could the intelligence would come from everything that it had learned from Twitter. So the kind of memory stuff that went into it, the data was all the stuff that it had heard on Twitter, and then it would become like an individual and post things. It turns out actually that all it had learned to be from learning from Twitter was to be a bit racist, to be transphobic, and to be making really kind of sexist jokes. So that's a good example of what happens actually in terms of what data is going in and what actually could come out at the other end. Because when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about somebody in a laboratory that's kind of grown some kind of digital human that's kind of like it isn't like that. It is a computer which requires data to go into. I mean, shouldn't forget that. What it then does with that data is the intelligent part, but fundamentally it's input and output. Sorry, just on the job interviews point, actually, in the filming the job interviews, that again is a potential issue, isn't it, for somebody that might have a particular health condition, could have a disability, which might mean that they kind of sit in a certain way. I'm thinking particularly with things like mental health, some people, you know, with anxiety, depression, those types of things could possibly come across negatively. Or I think they probably would actually come across negatively on that kind of AI system of reviewing things. The other application in HR and in organizations generally is this thing about automated decision making, and automated decision making again can be quite an attractive thing for employers and for HR to use. And actually, it's not an uncommon thing anyway. If you think about things like the Bradford factor, which employers and HR people use for measuring issues with sickness absence, it's not really a dissimilar thing. Actually, it's kind of creating a metric by which an employer is able to say, well, yes, in this circumstance, sickness is becoming a problem. So it's not a million miles away from that, albeit what it's doing is it's taking much more information. So the key kind of areas where I see automated decision making being, well, it is being used actually, but being used more extensively. Again, I'll go back to those figures in terms of the increase in use of AI. So it will be being done. It is being done, automated decision making in organizations, but it will happen a heck of a lot more. That's just absolutely inevitable. So automated decision making will often feature from an HR perspective in relation to things like capability. So capability to do your job. Now, capability includes performance. So really kind of whether you're kind of able to do your job, whether you've got the right skills, whether you're kind of trying hard enough, those types of things. But capability can also be sickness related. So it's so to do with sickness, so the amount of time that somebody's been off sick. So AI here would basically take lots of data about an individual, you know, clocking in times, finishing times, amount, you know, obviously it would depend on the role, but, you know, kind of input into that role. You know, you could take this much further, and it probably will go further. You might have the wearable technology, which might give you some information as to that individual. You might have this video technology, which is kind of giving you data about the individual. It sounds crazy, but it's genuinely happening. And all of that data then would be fed into the AI, and it would make a decision. And it would also base it upon previous examples to say, well, actually, this individual has reached this stage in their employee. This is, you know, these are effectively the issues that we've had. It's better for the organization to dismiss this individual. And that potentially something that's really happening. Very relevant in things like redundancy processes. So redundancy processes are all about really kind of making rational decisions, actually. So in a redundancy process, key thing actually is that the employer hasn't made a decision at the start. So it's basically they're keeping an open mind. They don't know who's going to be made redundant. They very open-minded about who's in the pool of redundancy. When you've got that pool of redundancy, they then have to, as an employer, you have to decide upon what metric you're going to use to evaluate people. And you're going to have to give them scorings, and then you're going to have to use that to make an objective decision based upon whether that individual will stay. And all of that stuff is very AI, actually. It's very kind of AI based. It's very metrics, number of sick days. It's, performance issues. It's all of that data that goes in and kind of reaches a decision. I guess the difficulty from an employee's perspective is, where's that data coming from? To what extent can the employee interrogate that data? So much of redundancy processes involve consultation, where you discuss the data that's being used, you discuss the selection criteria, you discuss the scoring, you do all of these kind of human things. You then get into the realm of what happens if the employee isn't happy with it and then makes a subject access request. So again, I'm not making any subject access request. And if you don't know, anybody that works for an organization, any data which is held about them, so anything that has their name on it and information which could identify them, belongs to that employee, and they're able to have that data. So very, very frequently now, so this happens so much. I don't have the statistics for it, but SAR requests have increased massively over the last year or so, and we will see those SAR requests also now asking for information that's AI based. So in the redundancy process, what information was fed into the AI, what AI system was used, what information is currently stored on that AI system. Really, really complicated stuff, potentially. It's being used also for decision making in terms of, so you can have I'll give you an example, actually, and it's a really, really interesting tribunal case which is in the tribunals at the moment. And for me, it's one of the first tribunal cases which really kind of deals with AI head on, and it's got all the kind of facts in it that you would expect to see in order for AI. So it's a bit like at law school when you get a case study and you get this kind of example situation, you have to kind of apply the law. So it's not been decided yet. It's still actually at a preliminary stage, but there's still plenty to see on it. So the case is called Manjang versus Uber. Have a look at it if you're interested in this area. You'll be able to find it pretty easily, and there's some kind of early judgments in it which kind of go through the facts. I won't go through it in too much detail, but just to give you the kind of sketch about what this case involves. So Uber, if you're a driver for Uber, they have this system where you have an app, and when you start your day driving, you go onto the app, and it basically, you take a picture of yourself and it reads that picture. And the reason why it does that is because it wants to know that the person that's in the car is the person that they think it is. So it's a kind of governance thing, it's a kind of safety thing. And it also as well gives them information about particular drivers and how many hours they're doing and all that type of stuff. So to some extent, pretty sensible. But it has this inbuilt thing in it that if there's issues with particular, so if it's got concerns that it really isn't the person that it's supposed to be, it will just reject the driver. The driver won't be able to do any work that day, and ultimately, if they can't do any work, it could lead to them getting kicked off. This is what happened to Mr. Manjang. So he was of African descent, so dark skinned. And it turned out that the AI that was being used had this quite significant bias against people with dark skin. So as somebody with dark skin using this app, taking a picture of yourself, you were significantly more likely to be rejected from doing your day's work than you would be if you were white. Now that is classic discrimination. discrimination is about somebody being treated less favorably because of a protected characteristic, so because of race. It's also this indirect discrimination, which is very relevant to this, which is when you set up a policy which applies to everybody, and that policy, because you apply it to everybody, puts certain people with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage. So that's within that kind of framework, really. Well, we use this AI system with everybody, we apply it to everybody, but indirectly, the effect of that is that the person with the protected characteristic, race, comes off worse because of the way that the AI system is designed. And this is something called an AI bias, and it's a massive problem, absolutely massive problem. Now, AI, again, I'm reiterating this, is only good as the information that's provided into it. So if there's any kind of information that goes into that system which has an inherent bias in it, then that will effectively replicate and kind of almost exponentially go through that software, because it's learning these kind of behaviors. So I think what's happened is people have just kind of gone into using this kind of technology without thinking about they're just relying upon it too much. Now, it's very easy for me to say, isn't it? Well, what you need to do is you can use AI and then you can just check it afterwards. But if you're dealing with massive organizations, I guess there's the time side of that you would need to consider. And also as well, it's quite difficult to do that in practice, because if you've not been through that kind of scoring exercise yourself and you're just kind of there at the end of it, it can be quite difficult to kind of say, well, that, it would have been quite hard actually for somebody at Uber to say, oh, well, that doesn't look right. It would have required a bit more kind of interrogation of the software itself and whether there was any bias in it, and more of an understanding. The fact was it was just used. We'll see what happens with that case and where it goes. I suspect it will probably settle. So what's redundancy? Redundancy is a reduction of a requirement for somebody to do a particular job role, so you don't need them as much. That's very much along the lines of what I'm hearing about in certain industries, where actually you have somebody performing a job, and maybe not the whole job, but quite a significant aspect of that maybe now could be undertaken by AI. That inevitably will lead to potential redundancies, and we've not seen that yet, but I suspect we will see it, and particularly as well with the kind of other kind of additional pressures that businesses are facing now. You could well understand somebody that wants to cut the budgets and rely upon AI, which is much more inexpensive. In terms of the kind of tribunal position with that, in terms of the legal position, there's nothing to say that a human should be preferred over artificial intelligence. It's in the same way that we've had it before with technology stepping in and doing the work of people. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution, which I think is maybe a bit over the top, but it's certainly a kind of significant thing that's going on. That's negative, so I want to kind of be a bit more positive about it, because I don't just want to talk about possible redundancies. There's the other way of looking at actually, that it's a big opportunity, this actually, because there's quite a lot of jobs that come out of this actually. So there's a whole kind of industry now which is developing around AI, so humans around AI, and it's things like developing different software applications which can be used to do different things. People that are becoming very kind of experts at what information you put into the AI. So effectively what I'm saying about this input-output thing, so a real kind of focus upon how you get the right information into it. So there's these kind of industries that are kind of growing around it. And in healthcare, big thing. So the World Health Organization have said that by 2030, there'll be a global shortage of 18 million health workers, which is pretty shocking actually. And the research says that there's quite a significant amount of that gap which can be plugged by using AI. And you think about that, you think about some of these kind of routine processes, these kind of routine procedures, these routine things that are capable of AI being able to do. I'm not sure I'd want a kind of robotic surgeon doing anything on me just yet, but maybe I just watched too much Short Circuit. AI is going to have a big impact on healthcare. I'm sure about that, but it will need some kind of bedding in, really, and it will need to kind of be something that's structured. The last thing is to suddenly go, oh, we've got this great thing, let's just get it doing everything without kind of thinking about how it properly integrates and how it works in practice. Another quick statistic, I thought this was interesting. So in 2021, 60% of the jobs that were done in 2021 didn't even exist in 1940. So things change and people adapt, and people kind of use this technology potentially to kind of free them up to do more things. And what do you need to do about all of this? Well, what you don't want to be doing is just kind of let it happen and just kind of start using it without thinking about it. So what I'm saying to everybody, and employment lawyers are always telling people to get policies, so I get that. With this, with artificial intelligence, absolutely 100%, you need to have some form of policy in place which deals with it. Basically, they'll all be. There's not some kind of one size fits all. I think they've got to be kind of, everybody will be doing it slightly differently. So if you're a marketing company and you've got people that are writing blogs, you need to have a discussion about whether an element of that is being done on GDPR. You need to understand it. And if people are saying, well, look, we use it to give us a bit of a broad brush kind of series of points to work on, there might not be so much of an issue, but you might want to put something in place to say, if you are doing that, we need to know about it. There's lots and lots of things that you can kind of do in that respect. You also need to give some space to talk about in the policy about those data issues, which I should say aren't clear legally, but as an employer, you can only do what you can do. So if you are putting a policy in place which says, well, look, this is what we see the position to be in terms of data, then ultimately you are doing the right thing. You're not kind of leaving it to chance, really. And anybody that's using kind of AI decision making tools, or will start doing that, you want to make sure that you're asking the right questions of that provider about things like bias. So you want to be asking those questions, and then you would of course incorporate that into your policy, which would identify that you've done those things. You've taken those reasonable steps. And I always say this about HR, and probably every webinar I ever do, because it's just dead important. So employment tribunals, what they look at is not so much the decision that you reached, but how you got to that decision. That's what it's about. It's like when you're at school and you get your maths question wrong, but you get points for your workings out. It's very much like that with employment law. So decisions that you're making where you're using AI, all of that, you want it recorded. You want evidence of your discussions about it. You want that evidence. People do it anyway. People that run businesses chat with each other about things. But for employment lawyers that want to prove things, we want to see it. So contemporaneous emails saying we might use AI for this. What do we think the issues are? How do we embed it? Those types of things. And the final thing is, have a look about how it might benefit your business. This isn't about me saying AI is terrible and it's dystopian and all this type of stuff. It really isn't. It's a very, very helpful thing for your business, but you've got to make sure it's right. You've got to do things properly, and you've got to all kind of slow back with it a little bit. So that's my view on AI and how it's going to affect the world of work, and it's going to affect it massively. There's absolutely no way around that. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I don't know if anybody's got any questions they'd like to ask me.
I have just put in the chat. We've got one come through straight away. Then.
Okay.
Can you hear and see me? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Two-part question.
Two-part.
About the past. Two-part. Sorry.
Oh, right,
two-part question about the past and the future. What must the legislative branches do now to catch up with AI in employment law and labour law, as it's currently being is currently being integrating into many cases online.
Mm.
What already exists in terms of judicial and legislative principles regarding AI?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's still really in a bit of a state of flux, really, in terms of where we're at with it. In my mind, things don't always necessarily require legislative. I've never been able to say that, legislative change. So it doesn't necessarily require that. But from my perspective, what it does really need is it needs more of an engagement, more of a conversation about it, which is something that ACAS and obviously CIPD do very well. And I think they've obviously done a lot in that space as well. But I think there's much more that needs to be done in terms of discussions with different sectors, different industries, to kind of understand the application of it, I think, a little bit better, and to kind of understand a little bit better the sentiment of people, because I think it's that's probably going to inform better kind of legislation, because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's strange. We've got this kind of odd thing where we've got a kind of real, Britain's set up to be one of the main players in AI, actually, but yet we've got these kind of ancillary things to decide. So from my perspective, there still needs to be a lot more done in that kind of space. I mean, I read the other day that tribunals, so the head of the employment tribunals has basically given the green light for AI to be used for smaller kind of decisions, so actual judicial decisions, so not even just kind of processing paperwork, but actually making quite simple judicial decisions, which is probably things like whether something's in time or things like that. So that's a big thing, that, isn't it? That's a big thing, and at the moment, I don't think that's probably been grasped by the legislation.
We've had another question from Terry, which is one that I find quite an interesting question as well, which is, what's your view on the ownership of the content created by AI?
So this is the answer when you've been practicing for a long time. I actually don't know. I don't know how that is going to play. It's going to require lots more debate, isn't it? Because there's different interests. For some people, it's kind of in their interest for it to be owned by the user. So imagine if you're creating blogs, you want those to be owned by you, don't you? Because they're your blogs about your company or your activities or whatever. So if it's owned by you, then that means that other people can't then exploit your blogs and do things with them. But of course, if it's owned by the AI machine, or well, not the AI machine, but the creators, the owners of that AI machine, then that creates all kinds of difficulties, really. There's talk about it kind of being a kind of third way, so it's kind of like a non-human entity that owns it, which is pretty strange. But it's just some of the legislation related to this comes from 1988. So I mean, 1988, I think I was using a ZX Spectrum at that stage. So I think what the AI capabilities were like then, I'm not sure.
That's led to a couple more come through now. Should we be certifying our work, whether it's human created or AI created? So should you be transparent about that and saying, this piece of work is created by AI, or this is a human created piece of work?
Within the organization, absolutely, definitely, you need to know. If you've got, it's like if you run a restaurant, isn't it, and you're the head chef, you want to know who's made the food that goes out, don't you? It's as simple as that. So that's why I say it's a kind of grassroots thing. It's where it's people in organizations now need to be aware of the fact that their employer has to know where that work is coming from, because then don't forget, it's the employer's liability. So if something goes out from an employee which has got copyrighted material, then that's on you as the employer. It's not on the individual. And there's been some really quite funny issues with this. There was a lawyer, I think in America, that was he'd used AI to produce his closing submissions, and apparently it was quite a good speech, actually, and I think he was quite proud of it. The issue was the cases that he quoted didn't exist. So you get this kind of strange thing where you get the information that comes out of it. It looks good, but it's just slightly wrong. I've tried it. Obviously, I think I did something like, can you write 600 words on disciplinary processes in the UK, just to see what it came out with. And it was really, honestly, it was really, really good. But there were a couple of bits in it that were wrong. And when you do the law, when you do any profession actually, or any job, you can't have those little mistakes. It's, you know, it's again, it's going back to the restaurant, isn't it? It's like sending some food out, and it's, well, the food was all right. It just had one nostril hair in it. It doesn't matter, does it? You don't. It's got to be right, and that's the major issue. It's almost because it's so good, people have become reliant on it, but not kind of interrogated really, really what it's actually producing and how it's producing it.
Mary Ann's asked, how prevalent is plagiarism with the use of AI? She's heard the stories of students using artificial intelligence and things like ChatGPT to create their essays and such. So how does it fare with plagiarism software checks, do you think?
Well, it's a nightmare, isn't it? I mean, I think I saw something on, I think it was Facebook, I think it was I think it was America actually. It was a college professor that was basically just going absolutely crazy with all of his students, because I think most essays that had come in had been done on Chat GPT. So it's just absolutely huge, and you know, it's going to be reliant upon, you're going to have to be using AI really to check whether something's being produced by AI. It's going to be that kind of thing where we're kind of double checking things. It's not really employment law based kind of a point, this, but it's, you know, I've got 3 young children, and my eldest is starting to become familiar with it. And you know, when you're learning something, the whole process of learning it, isn't it, is that you kind of go through that kind of journey of, you don't just, if you've just got somebody that just gives you something that you can just tidy up, you lose a lot, I think, through that.
With AI being such a new field, what would tribunals' view be in perhaps the absence of relevant case law?
They don't, to some extent, they don't really need the case law. Like, discrimination is discrimination. You know, if you've got a policy which says, you know, we use AI to do facial checks, and that facial checks puts one group of people at a substantial disadvantage, which it does, that doesn't require anything else for that to be a case of discrimination, because it just simply is discriminatory. So when I talk about the law not catching up with it, that doesn't mean that the law doesn't sanction this. In fact, actually, that's probably the issue. It probably almost doesn't fully understand what's going on. So the issues you'll have in tribunal, in practice, will be probably tribunal judges who don't really understand AI. That's what it will be. That's what it will be, and they don't really understand. So that will be a kind of learning process, won't it? With people that are making decisions. I mean, ultimately, you'll just have a computer that you'll be talking to, so you won't have to deal with these things. Hopefully not. I don't think that will be the case. You know, judicial decisions, you can imagine them being made, you know, whether something's out of time or not. Maybe there's an argument for that being all right, but to actually understand whether somebody's telling the truth or things like that, those are, for my part, they are human felt things in many respects. And so I do quite a bit of tribunal advocacy myself. And when COVID happened, I moved from kind of going into a physical tribunal courtroom to being at home, basically on Zoom. And it was, in many respects, it was quite good actually, because I didn't have to travel anywhere. I have all my notes nicely displayed out, different screens and everything, comfortable, scented candle. It was great, but there were certain things that were really missing from it, and that's particularly things like when you're cross-examining somebody, the way that they respond, the way that they look, those types of things. It's the sense you get is totally absent, totally and utterly absent.
And just tying in with that, what are the different ways that AI bias might interact with the Equalities Act of 2010? So if a pursuer was looking to bring a case for discrimination based upon seeing this bias, who would be held to account?
The employer. So it's the employer that's using a system. So they're completely liable for that system. So there's no, this would matter. If this was going to change, it would mean a massive legislative change, but it won't. It would have to be that the creator of the AI is in some way responsible for that and just discriminate. But it isn't. It's the employer that's used it. Now, further down the line, whether you could argue that somebody might then sue that company that's provided them with that software, that would require them to have made representations about there not being bias in it. I guess that's a slightly different thing, but the responsibility for it is the employer, and like I said, it's captured by the Equality Act. So even though it's new technology, it's captured by the Equality Act quite comfortably, I should say.
Thanks, Adam. That's it in terms of questions for now. But if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will get back to you via email. So, is there anything else you'd like to say, Adam?
Yeah, well, what we will so we'll send out just a copy of this as well, which hopefully might find useful. I'm very happy to send it out to anybody else that might find it useful as well. I don't think it's been spoken about quite enough as it should be. Like, it's been spoken about in a kind of like fun way, but not necessarily thinking about the fact that there's going to be loads of tribunal cases, and bizarrely, from what it appears from the tribunal, artificial intelligence is going to be sifting through a lot of them, which are dealing with issues about artificial intelligence. So that's the world we live in 2023.
Lots of thank you messages in the chat there as well. I'm sure they're popping up on your screen as well there, Adam.
Yeah, great. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming. We're going to be doing another webinar. This one actually was going to be about flexible working actually, but I got so excited about AI, I thought I've just got to do this one on AI. But the next one's on flexible working, and yeah, anybody who was on my menopause webinar a couple of weeks ago will know that the two things are very, very closely related in terms of flexible working and menopause. So we'll send out some dates for that next time. But I think that's everything. Thanks, Blake, as well for everything. And thanks again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. That would have been good.